What is up, YouTube? This is Azreow, and this is my very first YouTube video. I've chosen to do it on a topic that I'm sure is going to get a bunch of hate if people decide to watch my channel. But today, I want to talk about the the PS5, and the Xbox Series X. I want to start with talking about their CPUs and GPUs. I'm not going to talk about the SSD or memory here. I'm going to start with the two things that I've seen the most information going around about that is either misunderstood or people just decided to not listen to the Sony conference. I get that it was boring, but it was meant for game developers. They shouldn't have marketed it as a reveal, although I don't think they did. They marketed it as an in-depth analysis. So the first thing I want to talk about is the CPUs on these two machines. Now the CPU and GPU are actually put together into one chip called an SoC, or a system on a chip. This is how most modern day consoles are made. People used to call them APUs, now we call them SoCs. The SoCs are very similar in the CPU department, where they both use 8-core, 16-thread Zen 2 processors. These are very similar to a Ryzen 7 3700X on the AMD platform, or might just be a 3700, but they are a little slower than the off-the-shelf part. Now, what's important to note about these is a lot of people are like saying things like, oh, Sony's is variable, and a variable frequency of 3.5, and Xbox is locked at 3.8. This is true, kind of. First thing I want to point out is Xbox is locked at 3.8 if they don't use simultaneous multi-threading, and that's only 7 cores that they're using. 1 core is reserved for the operating system, so you really only get 7 cores of performance at 3.8 gigahertz. Now, if developers choose to use simultaneous multi-threading, which I hope they do, because the more multi-threading we use, the better, it downclocks to 3.6 gigahertz. Now, I want to talk about what that gigahertz means. Gigahertz is we say it's a clock speed, but what it really means is it's a way of measuring how many operations per second you can do with a CPU. So 3.8 gigahertz is something like 3.8 billion operations per second. 3.5 be 3.5 respectively. So you are talking about hundreds of millions in operations difference between the two, but that variable frequency is being talked about a lot. Now, Mark Cerny himself said they chose to go with a variable frequency because they wanted predictable thermals. So we've talked about the clocks. Now we need to talk about thermals a little bit. Thermals, or how hot the processor gets, is determined by how much power is being pushed into the processor and the speed at which it is moving. So in this case, the processors are being pushed pretty heavily, but they're moving at different frequencies. The GPUs are also going to be moving at different frequencies, and as I said earlier, they're on the same side or the same chip as the CPU. They're all on one die, or an SoC. And the reason Sony decided to go with a variable frequency is they are locking the power target. So instead of locking the frequency and getting power that's variable with variable levels of noise coming from the fan, they decided to lock the power input and vary the frequency of the processing so they could more accurately estimate what the thermals of the CPU and GPU are going to be. This is actually a very good thing for people that use consoles on a regular basis, because if you have ever used one that has gotten hot, it sounds like a rocket ship going to take off. And this is something I think a lot of people are not necessarily talking about on the Xbox side. I know Xbox has an interesting and unique thermal solution, and I'm not saying it's going to be bad. But we have seen a thermal solution similar to the Xbox Series X before, and that was in the Mac Pro from 2013, the trash can Mac. And anyone who used that, which also had AMD GPUs, by the way, different architecture, different heat, and those sorts of things, but it also had problems with heating and getting loud, and it would thermal throttle its performance. Now, I know that they said they locked these speeds on the Xbox, but when you lock a speed for a CPU or a GPU in the computer world, that's kind of like overclocking your CPU. And when you do that, you are pushing it to its max power as often as possible. This often degrades the life of the CPU or the chip that is being overclocked, because you're pushing it to its max. And when you're pushing it to its max all the time, and then you require it to do heavy lifting like you're going to do with 4K at 120 frames per second, even though that's not the promise, by the way, guys. Their promise was 4K at 60. That's what Microsoft promised. When you do that, you are degrading the life of your chip. So what I think is going to happen with the Xbox Series X is you will see the CPU die much more often. And I also think that you're going to have thermal throttling occur at some point. I do not see how one fan pulling air up from underneath the bottom of the console is going to help it. I don't see how you can keep it cool that long without it just saying, I'm either going to give you artifacting or glitches in your game or slow down your game. But I could be wrong. And you can call me a Sony shill all you want, that's fine. I am a Sony fan, and I'll be upfront about that. I'm not going to be someone like Dealer Gaming who's misinforming a lot of people and can't read. But that's why I'm making this video, is because I see these videos are misinformation touting an Xbox victory when we don't even see the systems yet. And that relates to power somewhat with those thermals, and that's the one thing that's going to be interesting, is Sony is mitigating the power through a chip, and when they have extra power coming to the CPU, they're going to send it over to the GPU. So it's very important to note that power consumption is going to be consistent on Sony's machine, and Xbox might vary a little bit. I think they're both going to be great machines. And I just don't like seeing the teraflop argument being made for the GPU side. And looking towards the GPUs, 12 teraflops versus 10.28 teraflops is not a huge difference. It may have been a huge difference last gaming cycle, but it's not going to be this time. I think the big difference is Xbox is going to have better ray tracing. I 100% believe that's going to be true. But I would really like to see someone like Digital Foundry, who has the resources to do it, but do a video of current AMD GPUs and find one that has more compute units and underclock it to that 20% lower difference in speed that you're going to get from Xbox, and see what the performance difference is versus a smaller graphics card with less compute units. A lot of people talk about teraflops, by the way, and they don't even know what a teraflop is. It's a measure of raw compute performance. A GPU doesn't necessarily just do raw compute. It doesn't just do floating point operations. It's meant to draw images on your screen, and that requires multiplicity of different measurements and different computation. So it's not a fair assessment to just say that. But 36 compute units on Sony at 2.23 gigahertz is absolutely insane. And Mark Cerny himself said he expects it to sit there most of the time. 2.23 gigahertz is an astronomical number, and they said they could only do that with variable frequencies. So I'm very interested to see how these things compare at launch, but I wouldn't call it a clear win for Xbox yet. So that's all I'm going to say about the two consoles for now. I do want to come back and talk about the SSD and memory situation. There's a lot of misinformation about that as well. But I hope you guys enjoyed my first video. I'll be making more of these as much as I can, as often as I can. And until next time, peace.